Firing Line with William F. Buckley, Jr.
Mr. Robert Vaughn is a professional actor who keeps in shape for thrush by running 2 miles and taking 42 vitamins every single day. There is much confusion about whether he is glad to be an actor. On the one hand, he has referred to it as a choice profession. On the other hand, he believes that life's noblest calling is politics. Both Aristotle and Plato, he has said, believed that the good politician is also the good philosopher, and I agree with them. Mr. Vaughn will one day soon complete his requirements for a PhD. His doctoral dissertation will be written on McCarthyism and the theater. Whenceforward, he will be known as Dr. Vaughn. And as he put it, quotes, people will have to take me seriously. Shortly before his great success in television and in the movies, Mr. Vaughn announced, after devoting a full year's thought to the subject, that, quotes, the war in Vietnam cannot be rationalized by moral men, a judgment he makes, one gathers, in behalf of himself and Plato and Aristotle. He became the head of the Speakers Bureau of the Democratic Party in California and tours the state, inveighing against the foreign policy of President Lyndon Johnson, who, by deduction, is not a moral man. Indeed, Mr. Vaughn recently signed a statement urging President Johnson to step down in behalf of some Kennedy, any Kennedy one supposes. Mr. Vaughn greatly admires them all. I'd like to begin by asking Mr. Vaughn whether he believes that one of the reasons a moral man can't, quote, rationalize Vietnam is that the elections scheduled for 1956 there didn't take place.
We shall be back in a moment for Mr. Vaughn's answer to Mr. Buckley's question. Ladies and gentlemen, I am C. Dickerman Williams, and I shall act as chairman of tonight's discussion between Mr. Vaughn and Mr. Buckley. The subject of the discussion is the war in Vietnam. Mr. Vaughn, would you answer Mr. Buckley's question? Can a moral man not rationalize the war in Vietnam because of the failure to hold the election scheduled for 1956?
That would be one of many, many reasons. I would go back to 1954, when we, the United States, installed the puppet regime of Ngo Dinh Diem. The regime was installed with no referendum or plebiscite from the Vietnamese people. I shall hesitate to mention South Vietnam in this discussion, because Vietnam, as we know, is one country now. There is no government of South Vietnam, there is no nation of South Vietnam, and there is no country of South Vietnam. We installed Ngo Dinh Diem with the support and help of Joseph Buttinger, General Edwin Lansdale, Wesley Fischel of the University of Michigan State University, and Cardinal Spellman. This was the Vietnam Lobby, as it was referred to.
And the Holy Ghost?
Pardon?
And the Holy Ghost.
And the Holy Ghost may have been involved in it at that time.
Well,
from that, let's get to 1956. From 1954 to 1955, no effort was made by the South Vietnamese in relation to the Geneva Accords to engage in any effort toward the elections that were to be held in July of 1956. In October of 1955, a referendum was held in South Vietnam between Bao Dai and Ngo Dinh Diem. Although it is rather probable that Ngo Dinh Diem would have won that referendum, the entire election was manipulated completely and totally by Ngo Dinh Nhu, his brother. So that we had an incredible figure of 98.6 of the vote turnout at that time. From that point on, up to July 1956, when the elections were not held, no effort was ever made in relation to the provisions of the Geneva Accords of 1954, and as a result, with our help, our pressure, our support, military and economic, we failed to allow the people of Vietnam for the second time since the end of the Second World War to have a democratic election. Therefore, I think that it is immoral, because I don't believe that we can stop the spread of communism by sacrificing the principles of democracy, which is indeed what we did do in Vietnam in 1956 when we stopped the elections.
Now, are you aware of the following statement having been made in 1956, quotes, I'm sure you are, because you are, as you've just shown us, a considerable student of the minutiae of that period. Quotes, the United States should never give its approval to the early nationwide elections called for by the Geneva Agreement. Neither the United States nor Free Vietnam was a party to that agreement, and neither the United States nor Free Vietnam is ever going to be a party to an election obviously stacked and subverted in advance, urged upon us by those who have already broken their pledges under the agreement that they now seek to enforce.
Am I aware of who said the statement? Is that the answer? No, I'm not.
It was John Kennedy.
I would disagree with John Kennedy on that statement.
Well, this is an act of lèse-majesté, as far as you're concerned. Well, I'm delighted at your increasing emancipation. I've been disagreeing with him for years. But I think it is significant that at least John Kennedy, whose existence and record you so often celebrate, took a point of view diametrically opposed from that which you just finished expatiating. Yes. Does this make him retroactively a non-moral man?
It makes him an inaccurate man in relation to his observations in that particular time period.
He didn't have the benefit of your information.
He may have had the benefit of the information, but he seems to have organized in a different way than is historically accurate, which might be called at that time a credibility gap also, or an alteration of history, or a misrepresentation of known facts. The United States on July 21st, 1954, signed an agreement unilaterally agreeing that they would not disturb the Geneva Accords. It was signed by Walter Bedell Smith, representing John Foster Dulles in Geneva. And one of the most shameful desertions of power in history, John Foster Dulles left Geneva when he couldn't get his way. And Bedell Smith signed that agreement. It indicated in the agreement that they would not disturb the agreements of 1954, and further, they would sanction any all Vietnamese elections. Therefore, the United States did indeed sanction and agree with the 54 Accords. And in addition, there was no government of South Vietnam in 1954. The only person there was the French puppet at that time, Bao Dai, who originally was the Japanese puppet from 1943 to 1945.
Mr. Vaughn, if I read history the way you did, I think I would probably take the same position that you did.
I do hope you reread it in that case.
It's not only, as somebody said, what you know that isn't, what you don't know, it's what you know that isn't so. I take it, to begin with, that you would have no objection in walking out of, let's say, the Hitler-Moscow Pact, would you? In other words, you wouldn't consider this anti-heroic.
I am going to resist any historical analogy between the Hitler-Moscow Pact
I advise you to
and the
do
Geneva
so.
Accords.
I advise you to resist all historical analogy. But you seem to be saying that it's very improper for somebody to walk out of a negotiating session no matter what. Now, wouldn't you walk out of a negotiating session if you were convinced that the best interests of international peace were being deliberately subverted?
Yes, I would walk out of that negotiating session.
Well, Dulles was convinced of that. Now, by the way, so
I think Dulles was wrong.
I know you do. I know this is clear.
Therefore.
But I'm interested not in the fact so much that you think he was wrong, but that some of the reasons that you give, among them being that he walked out of that treaty. Are you aware that the New York Times, which was never pro-Dulles, pronounced it a diplomatic disaster right after it was signed?
Yes, it was pronounced a diplomatic disaster then and
us,
now.
For
yes,
us. You and me.
Yes, I understand.
And under the circumstances...
Well, indeed it was, because we lost at the negotiating table.
Correct. Now, you say that there was no, quote, government of South Vietnam.
Definitely not.
Well, under the circumstances, why did the parties in Geneva agree that there was some significance to the 17th parallel? If there was no government of South Vietnam, why did they say that there will be elections, or should be elections in 1956, which seek to reconcile the interests of those who live under the 17th parallel and those who live north of it?
That is not what the Accord said, if I may correct you. The Accords indicated the 17th parallel as a temporary regrouping zone, not as a political boundary. It was temporary, military.
But why did you need a regrouping zone?
You needed a regrouping to prepare for the elections to be held in 1956, because it was necessary.
Now, wait a minute. If you have a regroup, if you have elections in California, you don't need to lay a line across the.
You do if there was a war in California.
Parallel. Aha. Why was there a war?
Well, there was a war because the French colonial regime was suppressing the indigenous will of the Vietnamese people.
No, but why was there a difference between North Vietnam and South Vietnam as far as all the people in Geneva were concerned?
Well, as far as Geneva was concerned, in September 2nd of 1946, when Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam a free state within the French Union, he signified Hanoi as the capital. Therefore, he had some particular interest in Hanoi. Now, we must go back once again to what happened after 1945.
I was talking about July, not September. In July in Geneva, they acknowledged...
I'm talking about 1945.
45. You said 54, excuse me.
45. He selected Hanoi as the capital of the Republic of Vietnam, a free state within the province of the Free States of France at that time. And shortly after that, when he was going to negotiate the eventual referendum that was to be held sometime between 1946 and 1951, he went on his way to Paris. And during this time, the French brought in a Trappist admiral monk named Admiral Georges Thierry Angenlou, who set up a puppet regime while Ho was gone during this time in Saigon. During this period also, General Douglas Gracie of the British forces, who was supposedly to regroup in the south, various Japanese and French, also, instead of sending the Japanese back to Japan after the war was over, gave them arms to fight against the Viet Minh, and also held...
Wouldn't you have?
No, definitely not.
Well, but you are aware that since way before 1945, the Viet Minh was connected with the Communist Party, and that Ho Chi Minh went on to slaughter a considerable number of people in order to attempt to establish his orthodoxy in the north, and that it resulted in very nearly 1 million people fleeing to this non-entity in the south. Aren't you sympathetic with people who resist Ho Chi Minh? You would surely resist him, wouldn't you?
I would not have resisted Ho Chi Minh at that time. No.
Well, that's
I
like
would have
saying
resisted him if I would have been one of the 1
you,
million that were being oppressed by him.
It's like saying that you wouldn't have resisted Hitler in 1933 because there was a communist menace.
No,
Is
it is not
point?
saying that.
Why isn't it?
Because there's no parallel between Hitler and Ho Chi Minh.
Well, I think there's a considerable parallel because some people try to excuse their defense of Hitler on the grounds that there was a crisis in Germany, and you're trying to excuse Ho Chi Minh, who is a very... no, but you are trying to excuse Ho Chi Minh, who is a considerable butcher on a very large scale, on the grounds that something that Indochina had something worse to fear than Ho Chi Minh. Aren't you saying that?
Well, as far as Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese people were concerned, it had something considerably worse to fear.
I'm talking about you.
Yes, I think it had. It had French colonialism.
Which was worse than Ho Chi Minh.
Undoubtedly, it might have been if it had continued much longer because of the entirety of the 9-year war that followed it.
I'm talking about whether it was. Or do you, by the way, let's get this straight, do you dispute the statistics about the extent of the butchery of Ho Chi Minh? Or are you saying that he didn't, in fact, kill the 50 or 60,000 people in North Vietnam, which even he subsequently apologized?
Definitely killed.
He did kill them?
Definitely, yes.
And did the French kill 50 or 60,000 people? I'm not talking about wars. Everybody kills everybody in wars, but I mean during peacetime?
Well, we're talking about a war that was going on from 1946 to 1954, in which the 50,000 people were indeed killed, right?
No, I'm not.
You're talking about the period after 1954?
Yes, yeah.
Well,
I'm talking about the great carnages post-1954 that caused this great refugee traffic to come south.
Well, that was not the only reason for the refugee traffic to come south.
What was the other reason?
The fact that there were 900,000 of those people going south were Catholics who felt that they could live better under the regime in the south because of Ngo Dinh Diem being a Catholic.
Well, there are an awful lot of people
and I believe Ho Chi Minh is not a Catholic.
Well, but there are an awful lot of people who are Catholics who don't leave a country simply because it's not governed by... There are 6 million Catholics in England. I'm not aware that any of them have left, even though it's a church-state situation there.
Well, do you feel that the Queen is as oppressive as Ho?
No, that's just it. And I'm quite sure. I'm quite sure.
Some Englishmen may challenge you on that.
Well, I'm sure you know who they are.
Yes.
My point is very simply that what we haven't, I think, really clutched onto is whether or not there is a reason for South Vietnam. And I think this is something we ought to get onto.
Gentlemen, we must interrupt this discussion for a moment or two.
Well, it seems to me, Mr. Vaughn, that for you to say that the refugees were in part drawn to South Vietnam because Diem was a Catholic. It's a little bit like saying that the Jews who left Germany during the 30s to come to New York did so because LaGuardia had Jewish blood and Hitler didn't. In other words, I consider it invasion. But let me ask you this, because I think this is central.
Your historical analogies are incredible.
I would expect you to resist history. Here is what I want to ask you. Even assuming that we might spend a long time, and scholars will spend a long time, disputing the provenance of the South Vietnamese government, much as one might dispute the provenance of the Israeli government, or for that matter, the American government. People can say, look, there weren't any more votes cast for George Washington than there were for Diem at a moment that he became head of state. What I want to ask you is this. Let's forget the democratic niceties here and simply ask this question.
Yes, we certainly have.
Yes, I know. I urge you to do so.
No,
because,
they have, I mean.
Because the difficulty with over-observing the democratic niceties is that things like America don't tend to happen, or other yes, anti-totalitarian. Isn't there a reason for South Vietnam? That is to say, do you find it odd that 11 million people should desire a government different from the government that obtains in the North under Ho Chi Minh? Does this surprise you?
Definitely don't think that 11 million people desire a government different than the North.
I didn't ask you that. I asked you whether you thought it odd.
I think it would be odd if they did, but they don't.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's let's get into that in a moment, the
yes.
factual question. But would you say this, that there is at least as much difference between the policies of the various people that Eisenhower and Lyndon Johnson and John Kennedy have backed in South Vietnam, and the policies of Ho Chi Minh as, let's say, between Republicans and Democrats in the United States?
You're drawing a distinction between the governments in South Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh as least as much difference?
Yeah, is there at least as much difference?
Well, I would say that there's about as much difference as there is between a Republican and a Democrat today.
Okay,
yes.
well then the very fact that some people choose to be Democrats while others choose to be Republicans suggests that some people feel strongly enough to make that point.
Yes.
Now, isn't it reasonable to suppose that people would feel strongly enough that it is worthwhile resisting a government of the known savagery of Ho Chi Minh to put up with Diem and Key and whatever their shortcomings?
Well, number one, they have not put up with it, obviously, since they've been fighting now since the elections were not held in July of 1956. And the way we indicate our difference of opinion with the Democratic and the Republican Party is by turning out a candidate by a democratic process called voting, the very process that we suppressed in Vietnam because it was apparent that we were not going to win.
How did we suppress that and when?
By installing Ngo Dinh Diem as our puppet in 1954.
Now, why do you say our puppet?
Our puppet, that's right.
You know what surprises me about the use of you love to use that word,
yes, it's a cute word.
Is that simultaneously you call him our puppet,
yes.
and you get sore as hell because he doesn't do what we told him to do, you see. I've never quite understood that. Everybody says he's our puppet, but they also say in that damn puppet, he simply isn't doing what we want him to do. Which of the two is the correct version? That he was recalcitrant or that he was a puppet?
That he did not do what we wanted him to do because we told him not do that. Therefore, he was our puppet.
We told him we wanted him to do something and then told him we didn't want him to do what we told him we wanted him to do?
I am certain that in the clandestine halls of Ossining in New York, where these discussions first took place between Cardinal Spellman and various other people, that it was the main intention of installing Ngo Dinh Diem there to not hold the elections. Therefore, he was our puppet because he did not hold them. I'm sure under our indication, advice, and counsel.
Who told you this?
Who told me this?
I would say. Why didn't he tell me? Whoever told you this? So I could have considered that.
Well, the reading that I have done told me this.
The reading told you that, let me rehearse. Cardinal Spellman went to Ossining.
Yes, Maryknoll Seminary.
And met with somebody and instructed
somebody was Ngo Dinh Diem.
To instruct John F. Kennedy, to instruct
No, John F. Kennedy was not at Ossining.
To instruct somebody not to have elections because we hate free elections, or because we think that in any free election, the refugees who had just finished fleeing from North Vietnam presumably fled to South Vietnam because they wanted to influence the elections to vote for a government like the government they had just finished fleeing from?
Well, that was an extremely long question. John Kennedy was not involved in Ossining or what was called at that time the Vietnam Lobby. which was made up largely of Catholics, were very interested in having what they called a democratic alternative in Vietnam.
What year are you talking
Democratic
about?
alternative.
What year are you talking about?
1950 to 54, when he toured the United States. He meaning Ngo Dinh Diem. Now, they were interested in having a democratic alternative in South Vietnam, or in the southern portion of Vietnam, and their alternative choice was Ngo Dinh Diem, and indeed he was an alternative to democracy, as history bears out.
Well, history doesn't bear it out at all. For instance, I happen to feel I've been extremely non-assertive, factually, you have to agree. I haven't asked you to believe that 2 and 2 makes 4 even.
Yeah, right.
But I'm not going to assert that I believe that the elections of 1957 were very democratic, and I believe that that the elections of the past few months, were there none either in the last few months, were also extremely democratic. But it seems to me that the trouble with your general analysis is that it does rest on the assumption that
it was
nobody...
quite specific somehow. I don't know how it got general.
Well, it tends to rest on the assumption that we are living, that we are all being intimidated by a vast hallucination, which you, in virtue of your special insights, have been able to penetrate, but nobody else has. Now, let's assume that the conservatives who are in favor of prosecuting the war in South Vietnam really want to do so because we want the Chase Manhattan Bank to colonize South Vietnam. But what about when you get JFK as president in 1961 saying, quote, "The United States is determined to help Vietnam preserve its independence, protect its people against communist assassins, and build a better life through economic growth," and says this in context of his endorsement of the then existing government of Diem.
I disagree with John Kennedy, and I disagree with him on many occasions. Let's take a later quote of John Kennedy, September 2nd, 1963. "We can give them advice, we can give them counsel, we can give them aid. But in the final analysis, it is their war, the South Vietnamese. They have to win or lose it."
Yeah, I agree with him.
Well, then you want to prosecute the war further, and we can get a colonialism of the Chase Manhattan Bank.
I think that ideally people ought to fight their own wars. I think it's absolutely ideal. Now, what are you going to do when they don't fight their own wars? You either decide, as a point of pride, you're going to refuse to help them, or you're going to say, yes, we acknowledge certain transcendent considerations. For instance, you know what I think? I think the French should have, well, I'll tell you, I think the French should have fought their own war against Hitler. And I think the Italians should have fought their own war against Mussolini. And I would listen with considerable respect to any president of the United States or presidential candidate who would say, if the damn French, with all of their manpower and all of their resources, can't look after themselves sufficiently to cope with Adolf Hitler, well, damn it, we're not going to send American people over there. As a matter of fact, all the presidents did say that, didn't they?
Yes. However, you're once again drawing a parallel that has no application to Vietnam whatsoever.
Why do you hate parallels?
Because there is no historical parallel with Vietnam anywhere.
Well, suppose I attempt to construct one.
Please do.
A historical parallel would be that there was an aggressive power, that's Hitler, to be compared with an aggressive power, that's Ho Chi Minh, that force A in both instances invades country B, and the good guys yell for help. Like de Gaulle, he yelled for help, though there was a Vichy government which would presumably correspond to those sympathizers with the North, with whom you, for some reason, feel an identification. And the question is, were we right in going to France? I should think a hell of a lot righter in South Vietnam, where there hasn't even been a de facto North Vietnamese government, than in France.
I smell the Munich analogy somewhere in the background, and I will resist it with all my energy.
Well, go ahead. Is it
there
sufficient?
Were two countries involved in the aggression that you referred to, Germany and another country. Is that not correct? A territorial boundary was crossed. Is that not correct? No territorial boundary was crossed in Vietnam.
It's also correct they had white skins.
Yes.
If you want to stress the differences, it's also correct it happened 25 years ago.
Yes.
That's another difference.
Well, you cited this as a
I'm talking
parallel.
about
I'm saying there is no
significant
parallel
differences.
there.
I'm talking about significant differences.
Well, you just said this was a significant parallel.
Yes,
it is
it
not
is.
significant at all.
Well,
It is
give
one
me
country.
significant differences then, not insignificant.
I did not say there was not significant differences. I said there is no parallel with Vietnam in history.
The fact that they crossed a Dutch border, whereas the 17th parallel
Is not a border.
All right. Why? Because it hasn't been sanctified by sufficient usage as a border?
No.
Well, in that case, nobody has any right defending Israel because its borders are hardly sanctified by history. They're completely arbitrary.
Gentlemen, I'm sorry I must interrupt for a moment or two.
You say we were in Israel, Mr. Vaughn. You want to drop that?
Yes, definitely.
All right, we'll drop that. You seem in your speeches in connection with Vietnam to make a considerable point of a fear that you find, I gather, clouding the judgments of those Americans who disagree with you. And you said recently, for instance, that we have come to fear the red menace abroad, the creeping socialism at home, to fear a tiny island 90 miles off our shores, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
Now, let me ask you this. Why is it wrong to fear the red menace abroad?
Oh, it is definitely not wrong to fear the red menace abroad when there's a realistic need to fear the red menace abroad. I find no realistic need to fear the red menace of Ho Chi Minh trying to liberate his country, as he has been doing for 30 years, from foreign aggressors, Japanese, French, and American.
Well, I can understand you saying that, provided you're not one of the people being liberated and hanged. Presumably, if you're one of the people whose throat was slit, you would have some feeling of fear for your liberator, wouldn't you? We know that there were Nazi sympathizers in France. I forgot you hated history, but who looked forward to the liberation
inadequate
of
parallels
by Hitler. All right. Well, let's at least admit that the people who were slaughtered by their liberators have reason to fear their liberation, correct?
That would be an accurate statement.
That would be an accurate statement. But you were talking about fearing the red menace abroad. Now, well, to continue to quote you, we fear a tiny island 90 miles off our shores. You find that irrational, do you?
Oh, definitely.
Well, did you disagree with President Kennedy when he announced his fear of that tiny island sufficient to deliver an ultimatum to the Soviet Union, which some people said might bring on a Third World War?
Definitely. Would you like me to tell you why?
Yes, sir.
All right. There was an opportunity in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I presume is what you're referring to,
Right.
to make the first offer there in regard to taking a base out of Turkey, for instance, which eventually was done. The alternative of that particular argument between Russia and the United States was to bring the world to the brink of nuclear holocaust to save face for John F. Kennedy because of his debacle in the Bay of Pigs and possibly also in Laos.
But you do recognize, don't you, that that's rather a perverse analysis. By that I mean that the closest admirers of Mr. Kennedy, men like Mr. Schlesinger and Mr. Sorensen, think that this was a high act of statesmanship. That this
I disagree
was a correct,
with Mr. Schlesinger and Mr. Sorensen.
I think it's increasingly interesting how many people you do disagree with.
Yes.
And eventually maybe I can find you disagreeing with Plato and Aristotle, and then we'll
Yes,
end
I
it.
do. I've written a number of papers on this matter.
And
And I'll be happy to send you photocopies.
I'm delighted.
Mr. Vaughn,
I was about to admit that I hadn't read your criticisms of Plato and Aristotle, but I would be afraid to confess that ignorance.
yes, Mr. Buckley, I'm afraid I didn't quite get a point of Mr. Vaughn, and I'd like him to clarify it for me if he would. Are you saying that the Cuban Missile Address by President Kennedy, the position he took in regard to the Cuban missile bases, was to save face as regards the Bay of Pigs?
Yeah, that's exactly what it
Yes,
is.
that's exactly what I said.
I thought you said it, but I wasn't quite sure.
That is an accurate statement.
Yeah. Say, is there a left-wing equivalent of the John Birch Society?
Well, I don't think there's anything quite that secret about the left wing. So there is no equivalent, to my knowledge.
You think the left wing is entirely free and open, Mr. Buckley?
What's that?
You think the leftists are entirely free and open, unlike the John Birch Society?
Well, I don't know anything that isn't free about the John Birch Society, since people can leave it, can join it or not. I'm not aware that they use blackmail or whatever.
Well, I think they do
keep
censor
them
their
in.
membership, don't they? They don't tell who's involved.
No,
You're not a
they
fan
do
of the
not.
Birch Society, I'm aware of that.
No,
Or perhaps
no.
you've changed since
No,
read
but I don't
yours.
know that makes it necessarily a secret.
That you're not a fan of it?
Then, no, I'm not. After all, it's also a secret who are the stockholders of various companies that aren't listed on the exchanges and so on and so forth. But I don't think that the secrecy of the John Birch Society is interesting. The reason I raise the point at all is because it does seem to me that your point of view and Mr. Welch's are in a sense complementary. You know, he thinks that we lost whatever we lost during the 50s because Eisenhower was a communist, and you think that we almost went to war because of the pride of John F. Kennedy and the necessity that he felt for some retroactive vindication as a result of the fiasco of the Bay of Pigs. And this finds me so, I find it so sort of removed from reality that I find myself, I'm confessing my own reactions, looking at this rather clinically rather than analytically. I know that you're not afraid to disagree with people, and I admire this in you very much. I disagree with an awful lot of people. but the point is, do you agree with Euclid or anybody that makes reasoning possible?
Do I agree with Euclid? Not.
No, he's old-hatted.
Yes.
I forgot. I keep forgetting. But you do see my difficulty.
Yes, I do see your difficulty.
Yeah, it's perhaps the difficulty that you might have in interrogating Mr. Welch, who simply smiles at you condescendingly, say, "But don't you understand, Mr. Vaughn? He was a communist." You know, incidentally, I think this will amuse you, Mr. Spivak once said that the only time he was ever embarrassed on a television program was when he had on Senator Bilbo, and it was the last moment, and he had a question that he was going to clobber him with, and he finally started, he said, "Mr. Bilbo, how do you react to Senator Taft's statement yesterday that you're the worst senator in the history of the United States ever to have been seated?" And Bilbo said, "But don't you understand, Mr. Spivak, Senator Taft is a communist." And I find a little bit of this difficulty in discussing Vietnam with you, because I quote Kennedy, I quote Sargent, I quote Schlesinger, I quote all of the people who make up the liberal position, even those who disagree with our participation in Vietnam, and you simply toss them away, the way you toss Hitler away. I see maybe why Man from U.N.C.L.E. is so surrealistic. This is your mode, isn't it?
No, I don't think there's any parallel between Man from U.N.C.L.E. and my tossing Schlesinger, Sorensen, and Kennedy as being unrealistic. But please go on.
Well, do we, all right, let's assume then that you're correct, that Mr. Kennedy deliberately precipitated what you call a crisis that might have led to a Third World War Holocaust because he wanted to assuage his hurt feelings over the fiasco 18 months old. Still, it did in fact work, did it not? That is to say, the missiles were taken away, and there were a great many people who were manifestly relieved, were they not? Now, what about people who didn't care about Kennedy's reputation? Were they entitled to fear the existence of missiles armed by Khrushchev in Cuba?
Of course.
I mean, this wasn't frenzy or paranoia, was it?
No, we have every right to fear them.
Well, then
the
why
tactics used to deploy them, the problem that I'm discussing, and I felt that this was the wrong way of going about it.
Well, why did you make fun here of people who feared a tiny island 90 miles off our shores?
Well, it's not the island we were worrying about then, was it?
No, obviously it's not the island.
That is out of context with
It's the
communism
people,
in general.
correct,
which I was referring to.
Yeah, but don't you tend to make this mistake rather uniformly? Nobody fears an island. One fears the people on that island, right, and their resources. You say here, like all anti-isms, anti-communism is not a policy but an expedient to conceal the fact that we have no policy. That in itself is interesting, but you say communism is an ideology, and an ideology cannot be killed with a gun. That's true, but an ideologist can be killed by a gun, can't he?
Yes, and if we kill all of the ideologists, then we will have indeed killed the 40% of the world, and we will be right.
Well, now, what am I to conclude from what you've just said? That we shouldn't kill the ideologist under any circumstances? As a matter of fact, elsewhere, you do seem to sound like are you a pacifist?
No, definitely not.
You're not a pacifist?
Hit me.
Mm-hmm. You're not a pacifist, but you said on February 19th, 1966, quote, "No longer is justification necessary for war because war is no longer justifiable."
That's right.
Didn't you figure that out? Doesn't that make you a pacifist if you say war is no longer justifiable?
Of course it's not justifiable in a nuclear age.
Well, then you are a pacifist.
No, not at all.
Perhaps Mr. Vaughn will give his definition of pacifist.
Well, I'm sure that a pacifist is a person when attacked will not respond. If I am attacked, I will respond.
Well, what if you're the United States and you're attacked?
I will respond. Therefore, I'm not a pacifist, nor should the United States be a pacifist.
Well, would you be justifiable if you responded, if you were the United States and were attacked?
Yes, I would be justified if...
Well, then you take back what you said on February the 19th, 1966.
No, because I'm referring to, if you'll read a little earlier in the statement, nuclear war.
Well, you didn't say that.
Yes, I said that
You
in
said
that speech.
it might result in nuclear war, but granted, any engagement might result in nuclear war, i.e. by ex hypothesi, one can assume it might result in nuclear war.
Right.
So I'm asking you, if you were the United States and you were attacked, would you corporately respond, even though there might be a nuclear war as a result of your response?
Yes, I would respond.
You are. So you're not a pacifist, as I understand the term pacifist.
No.
And I'm relieved to hear this.
Yes.
Especially since I understand you're going to run for president, is that right?
Definitely.
Well,
And we can rid the government of Schlesinger and Sorensen and everyone.
and all those colonializers. As we terminate this part of the colloquy, I understand that you do believe that there is a paranoia on the part of the United States, certainly on the part of its governors.
Yes.
That we really don't have anything to fear, but we are acting as though there were a great deal of fear. A red menace, for instance. Even though you grant that some people did have something to fear from those missiles in Cuba.
Well, it's the extent to which we fear it and the actions that are precipitated by that fear. Whether we go to war, whether we try to compete against the red menace in an economic way, particularly.
Is anybody...
It's quite apparent to the world that communism has failed as a system, economically.
Oh, it's not apparent to the world at all.
Oh,
it's
I
apparent
think
to
so.
me and to you, but it's not apparent to the world.
Well, that's really the whole
There are an awful lot of people who are very enthusiastic. Incidentally, it's very interesting. You keep talking about these old Marxists here. Bettina Apteker isn't all that old.
No.
And there are actually more members of the Communist Party now than there were 5 or 10 years ago. So I think it's rather optimistic to suppose that people concert in believing that communism has failed.
Is that a question?
Yes. Rhetorical.
Rhetorical, I thought it was. Smacks of that somehow. Yes, I think it is difficult to say that Bettina Apteker should be representative of America in relation to fearing or loving communism.
That's all?
That's it.
Well, is the following also it, that perversity does exist? Here you are saying that no moral man can justify the Vietnamese War, and yet we know that over 75% of the American people support that war. Ergo, over 70% of the people are immoral. Now, by the same token, mightn't I say, it is true, or ought to be considered true, that communism has failed throughout the world, but nevertheless, it is manifestly true that a lot of people continue to support it for whatever reason, perversity, faith,
ignorance,
dogma,
I think, would be the appropriate word, both for the American people supporting the Vietnam War and the rest of the world supporting communism.
These people aren't so ignorant. For instance, IQ-wise, I'm sure Mr. Gromyko would do very well at Southern California University. I'm sure he could become Dr. Gromyko in no time at all. It's not just a matter of ignorance, it's a matter of a whole series of value preferences, a whole way of viewing reality.
Yes,
and some people feel that some people feel that here and there Marxism must be modified, as indeed it has been modified in the Soviet Union, but they would certainly look with considerable contempt on your notion that it has, quote, failed. Now, mind you, I'm agreeing with you.
Yes.
But I'm asking you to observe the fact that a lot of people don't, as one of the constituents of the reality on which a foreign policy has to be based.
Well, I think that if the American people were to be apprised of the true history of our involvement in Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson would lose that 75% overnight.
Why don't you apprise them? We've got a free press here,
I've been doing my
don't we?
best. I have been on the stump,
Yeah.
Mr. Buckley.
Well,
You've been quoting from my
maybe-
appraisals.
Maybe they don't find you very convincing.
Possibly not, but I have...
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we forgot to interrupt for a moment or two. Mr. Vaughn, you put a great deal of emphasis on the failure to hold the elections in 1956. If those elections had been held in 1956, would the elections insofar as held in North Vietnam have been free elections?
Well, there was the group of people called the International Control Commission that were set up to make certain that they were, since they were never held. It would be impossible to say that they could have been free because they were not held. That was one of the specifics of the Geneva Accords. The ICC was a provision.
Suppose you guess.
I would guess that they would have been free, yes.
It's your opinion.
And it was Eisenhower's guess that Ho Chi Minh would have won.
Mr. Buckley, would you comment on that statement of Mr. Vaughn's about quoting President Eisenhower?
Yeah. I think we ought to lay that ghost, if only because Eisenhower himself is the most impatient of those who use it. What he said in his memoirs, quoting himself at that time, was that so gratefully did the people of South Vietnam look on Ho Chi Minh after the Dien Bien Phu that they thought of him as the George Washington of Vietnam.
Correct.
It is also true that within a matter of months and after a few dozens of thousands of slaughters, 1 million people, constituting one of the major migrations in the history of refugees from tyranny, came to a very solid anti-conclusion about Ho Chi Minh. Now, we're talking about 1956,
yes.
Not 1954. And in 1956, Eisenhower never said that he would have won the elections.
I will challenge that because he said if the elections were held during the time of the fighting, Ho Chi Minh
Yeah, that's
would
right.
have won. Yes.
That's right, during the time of the fighting. We're talking about 2 years later.
Mr. Buckley, let me ask you a question. You've spoken of the Red Menace. Do you think the United States can act as world policeman against the Red Menace?
I don't know what you mean by policeman, Mr. Williams.
Do you think that the United States should lend assistance everywhere throughout the world to against any country suffering from communist aggression, let us say, by infiltration or by the crossing of a frontier?
Well, I think in the first place that we have pledged to do so by Democratic and by Republican administrations. There's a lot of rhetoric on that subject in JFK's speech, his inaugural speech, and several other speeches. We are pledged to do so. It is also true that the monolith that we considered at the moment those pledges were made is here and there showing signs of disintegration, and here and there showing signs of separatism, so that conceivably the moment might arrive when we will look on a developing communist situation in a particular country as autonomous, as truly indigenous and unrelated to the central inanity, and that we will consider at that moment that we will no longer go to their aid any more than we are committed to police the governments of all of the rest of the world. But for so long as there is a sound strategic assumption that any augmentation in communist power means a relative diminution in the power of the West, then I do think we do have that obligation.
For my liberal
the policy of containment.
Yes.
For my liberal friends, I'm glad that you said that and not I.
Mr. Vaughn, I have a question for you.
Yes.
That's a little convoluted, but I'll ask you later.
Suppose Ho Chi Minh began the terrorist infiltration of Thailand and began to take over villages in northern Thailand. Would you favor United States assistance to Thailand to resist that aggression?
No.
What about
would you favor
Key West?
Key West?
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Under what circumstances would you favor United States assistance to resist communist aggression which took the form of infiltration rather than the crossing of a border?
When there is a distinct threat to our national security.
Was he in Korea?
Was there? No. It was the United Nations effort, not the United States effort.
Oh, come on. 99.9% United States.
Yes.
Sure.
Under the banner of the United Nations.
Yeah, because...
We control the United Nations, obviously. It was
no,
us.
in the first place, the relevant communist was out having lunch or something when we got the vote through. Otherwise, he would
That's
have vetoed
correct.
it. Yeah.
Right.
Now, if he had vetoed it, would you then have been against our going to the aid of South Korea?
I think that we probably would have, and I probably would have voted against it.
You would have voted against it. Yes. No, you were really against our going to the help of South Korea.
Without international sanctions,
Okay.
yes.
Suppose there were international sanctions in favor of helping Thailand. Would you then be in favor of it?
Yes.
So what matters to you is whether we can get Upper Chad and Lower Volta, or whatever it is, to make a majority, right? That's what matters.
What matters to
The
me...
numerical majority in the United Nations constitutes the morality of any given situation.
May I ask Mr. Vaughn to clarify his point a moment? Yeah. Did you say that you would favor United States assistance whenever the United Nations voted to oppose?
Yes, he did.
I know, I said international sanctions.
Yeah.
Those are treaties of pacts that we may have where our constitutional processes take it to the government of the United States and then it's taken to the United Nations. Not abrupt unilateral intervention as in the Dominican Republic.
I know. And in other words, he is reaffirming his position that if the UN says okay, it's okay.
Yes.
And that's your definition of morality.
I am interested in the rule of world law, not the rule of the jungle.
Who
and
says
the rule of the jungle is the unilateral intervention by the United States in areas where they have no sanction by their allies or the dissonance in the United Nations.
And you consider that world law consists of whatever arithmetical tabulation you have at any given moment in the General Assembly of the United Nations?
Yes, arithmetical tabulation in relation to the process of voting is called democracy, and that's why I agree with it.
Yes, but we have never subscribed to a, quote, democracy that assigns equal rights to many states, to the Azores, for instance, or whatever, and to the United States.
That's what the United Nations
This is a
assigns.
Vaughn contribution to international law.
Well,
is this what you write?
Yes, it is, and I'm delighted that it occurred on this show.
Well, we should put a plaque right here.
Right.
Mr. Buckley, in one of his remarks, Mr. Vaughn emphasized his opposition to help for Thailand and help, I take it, for South Vietnam because United States national security was not threatened. Do you recognize that as a factor in the course the United States should pursue?
No, sir, I do not. It seems to me that Mr. Vaughn is correct to this extent that we've got no business entering into foreign situations that do not relate to the security of the United States. And if we could conveniently transport Thailand and Red China on over to another planet, that our responsibilities would dissipate. But there is a continuum, I judge, and Mr. Eisenhower, who is occasionally quoted by Mr. Vaughn, also judges, that there is a direct relationship between what happens in Southeast Asia and what happens over here.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we must take another interruption. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have had a conflict between a hawk and a dove. Unfortunately, we must bring the conflict to a close. Whose feathers were the more ruffled, the hawk's or the dove's? I must leave that to you to decide. As chairman, I can't make a decision myself, I regret to say. Thank you, Mr. Vaughn. Thank you, Mr. Buckley.